Welcome to the Democratic Service meeting for July. The first item is apologies for absence.
Yes, Chair, we've had apologies from Councillors Thomas, Treharne, Dimmock, Jones and Howard.
Thank you. Declarations of interest? None. Public open forum? Well, it's packed up the back there. Right. To approve the minutes of the previous meeting. So can somebody approve them?
Move, Chair.
Thank you. Right, number 5 is dedicated head of democracy. I think that's where you have to leave. Right. And I hand over to the Chief Executive.
Thanks, Chair. Maybe just a brief cameo appearance from me this afternoon. Members, you will be aware that actually by law, Council has to establish a statutory head of democracy position for the organisation. The report sets out the basis for that appointment, and you'll recall that Kelly Byrne has been fulfilling that role for the Council for probably close to 18 months now. You'll also be aware that Kelly will, to all intents and purposes, leave the Council at the end of this month, so we need to put in place an alternative arrangement. It falls to me as Head of Paid Service to make a recommendation to you as in your committee role, which, if you agree, via the minute of this meeting, will be onward reported to full Council. My recommendation to you is that Matthew Gatehouse takes on this role. Matthew's position within the organisational structure makes absolute sense for him to assume the role, given that he now heads up democracy, performance, policy and one or two other areas of our work. Matthew is now an experienced middle to senior leader within the organisation, and I know is very, very keen to take on the role. It carries no additional remuneration, but it does carry responsibility laid out in statute. So I guess, Chair, that would conclude the input that I was looking to make. We need to have a designated officer. I think we have a logical choice within our organisational structure. That logical choice is keen to take on the role, and consequently I recommend him to you.
Thank you. Members, do you agree with the proposal that the Chief Executive is putting forward? Yes, David.
I recommend acceptance of the proposal made by the... Sorry, I could sneeze. By Paul.
Thank you. If I got a second to that, yeah. Right, Matt.
Sorry about that.
It's cooling, isn't it? Congratulations.
Thank you.
Right. Number 6 is the response to the Assembly inquiry. Are you taking this, John? No?
That'll be myself, Chair.
Right. All right then.
And others may come in. I think this is an opportunity on behalf of the committee to look at a draft response and debate it ahead of potential submission to a Welsh Government inquiry on diversity in local government. So the Assembly is presently looking at this issue. We have an opportunity as a council to put a response in by a deadline of the 24th of August, which leaves us little opportunity for full council debate. But nonetheless, it sits very closely with the remit of this committee in terms of promoting democracy and ensuring a diversity of candidates and the opportunity to involve a broad range of people in local democracy and decision making. So the committee has set out clear terms of reference, which are set out at 3.2 of the report, understanding the importance of diversity amongst local councillors, understanding key barriers to becoming a more diverse pool of candidates for local government elections, exploring good practice, and the potential impact of proposals in the Welsh Government's Green Paper. Now, obviously, there have been some subsequent sort of rollbacks on areas regarding mergers within that Green Paper a number of weeks ago, and this consultation was launched prior to the Minister rowing back on issues around local authority mergers. So what we have before you today for discussion is a selection of views drawn from conversations with some elected members around the authority, largely a sort of self-identified group. And what this draft response doesn't purport to be is an extensive view. It recognises that it's drawn from the views of people who are themselves already in politics, and therefore doesn't comment on the views of those who may have been discouraged from entering or not be aware of the opportunities. So it's before you today to allow you to debate the issue of diversity in local government and to decide whether, in terms of the response you see before you today, you would like to make any changes or additions to that prior to it being submitted as a response of this committee on behalf of the council. Broadly, what we have here in terms of response raises some of the challenges experienced by members within this authority, including the difficulties of balancing the role of county councillor with paid employment, with family life, and the potential barriers that causes to others in entering problems. It also in entering politics, I should say. It also talks around some of the potential reasons for that, including a perceived lack of understanding or a lack of understanding within the community of what the role of local councillor is, and some of the barriers it can cause people in their careers, partly because people don't necessarily understand the role of councillor, but also concerns around the time constraints and how that may impact on people's careers, and a lack of understanding amongst employers, which then can sometimes result in the role of councillor not necessarily being understood when people apply for work, particularly when people have taken time out to focus on politics. So it presents a range of issues. It also comments that these are sort of systemic issues and actually quite difficult to address at some level without a more systemic reform of the whole system. You know, for example, much higher remuneration for the role of councillor would enable people to focus on politics with less concern around career and the impact on incomes. But it also recognises that's probably quite unaffordable within the current level of resources. It also talks around some of the positive things that have happened here in Monmouthshire, such as work that goes on with young people in Local Democracy Week. The decision you took as council to allow within the Constitution remote attendance and remote voting at meetings, which potentially makes it a more attractive offer, giving increased flexibility. So, Chair, with your permission, it's really there to encourage discussion, to inquire of members of the committee whether it adequately reflects the views that need to be captured within this. So the recommendations are to look at this committee, to look at this response, to establish whether you wish to submit it and whether you wish to make any amendments to the draft response prior to doing so.
Thank you, Matt. Right, members, it's open now to questions. Have anybody got any queries or any questions they'd like to ask? Badin?
Thanks, Chair. It's a comment, really. Mr. Gatehouse, I'm glad that you mentioned the Youth Council, because I think there's a really important job to be done in terms of getting in touch with young people, just to help them realise that actually there's nothing special about being a councillor, and that you can become a councillor when you're 21. You don't have to wait till you're mid-late 60s, as many of us who recently joined the council are. I think that when they came and met with myself as chair of CYP and with the cabinet member for education and the leader of the council, it was a really stimulated discussion. And I think from their side came the view that the council should be promoting the idea of local democracy and democracy generally for young people. I would commend the Welsh Government's plan that 16-year-olds should have the vote in elections in Wales. I think that would be a splendid way of increasing the participation of youngsters in the democratic process. It seems extraordinary that you could get married, join the army, and so on, and not vote. And I think that one really big thing, and I'd like to see it perhaps added to the list of recommendations, is that as a council we commit ourselves to trying to work with young people and young people's organisations to get them positively engaged in the democratic process, so that young people in their early 20s would actually want to stand for this council, because my goodness, I think they'd be a ray of sunshine if they came in here.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Thank you, Chair. I'm just wondering how many councillors actually replied to this response. Was it sort of all, emailed in writing to you, or was this, did you pick this up as sort of by having conversations with individual councillors? Because there are two channels for this to be fed back, isn't there? There's one directly, so some councillors may have done that, so we can't really judge what those replies are. So it'd be good to know how many people we're talking about with regard to this document, the responses on this document, if possible.
Yes, thank you. That's a very good point. It was remiss of me not to mention it. So firstly, the point, yes, as well as this, there's an opportunity for people to feed back individual views, and I think I put the link to that within the report. This was largely an audience of people who had sort of come forward to share views on the basis that they were aware that the consultation was happening. And it captures the views of, I think, six councillors that met or have conversations with myself or Hazel Islet. So we didn't sort of go out and actively canvass views, but where people had come forward to share experiences, we used those to form the basis of a report, just to give a starting point really for debate at this committee.
Francis?
Yeah, I think clearly it doesn't preclude anybody else putting forward views about this. I, like some other members, was involved in sort of some of the diversity and democracy work, and frankly find it all a bit disappointing in the end. I think one thing I think is important is either there's a desire to take this seriously or there isn't, in which case, whilst it may seem like a good thing to do, but there's no point in investing time if, for example, Welsh Government and generally local government is not really that interested. The bits with the young people, yes, that's great, with the small group of young people that we work with, but there's no systematic means, and that, frankly, is unless we want to engage in a systematic means, is also just. It's great to tick a box or, say, oh, well, we've done this, but actually we're not really driving change systematically. Just a couple of points I just wanted to reflect, really. I think one thing, and I think it's really important to note, So when we talk about diversity, to my mind, some of the most obviously that relates in particular to things like protected characteristics. And we know that generally we have a profile amongst local councillors, which is male, which is older, and which is not necessarily particularly ethnically diverse. However, I think it's also important to note that diversity of experience, of professional experience, of personal experience are also really important factors, and I don't think enough is given to that. So I'm talking about socioeconomic differences and not just those that are, easily noted under protected characteristics. In principle, I'm sure that everybody would welcome a better, more even balance, in particular of age, gender, ethnicity, and disability. I attended quite a lot of the diversity in democracy events, and it was really interesting. There are lots of things that I'd never even thought about that could be barriers to people entering public life, and in particular elected democracy. So that's the first point. I think it's not just about diversity in the very traditional sense. For example, do you have any people who've ever been in the care system on the council? Because the key thing is the link between the people we're making decisions on their behalf and our own experiences. We cannot make good quality decisions without doing an awful lot of additional work if we've no personal experience of, certain issues. So we need to ideally have both a better balance on the council and expose ourselves more to some of these key issues. The second point really is regarding the remuneration. I really don't think there's a straightforward answer. However, I would like to note in our response that at one time the local members' remuneration was tied to median income. That link has been broken for some time now. So I think there needs to be a very clear explanation why it is that is the figure reached. So, it goes back to the independent remuneration panel. I think they need to explain why we are at this level. So not just about, the current economic climate, but at one point there was a link between 2/3 median income and then a certain proportion of voluntary time. That was how the remuneration was made up. It's no longer the case now, and I think we need to understand. So on what basis have they arrived at that better? And I think that they talk often in the independent remuneration panel about wanting to increase diversity. I think that on the basis of where we currently are, we have to accept that we won't do that. And I think we have to be really clear about that with the remunerations as they currently are. Now, I don't have a straightforward answer, but I just think that we need to acknowledge that the remuneration element of it does give us a certain set of outcomes. And we have to be really clear about those. And I think it would be useful to note that in our report. And the last point, which I think certainly in discussions I've mentioned this, and it does talk about, understanding the role of the councillor. But in terms of it being seen as a valuable way of gathering skills, experiences and others that could be put to good professional use if ever we did genuinely want to attract, a balance of age, then we talked about potentially having some means of almost having that accredited in some way, so that, particularly in the public sector, but also in the private sector, one could use those years of service to demonstrate a particular skill set. Obviously, there'd have to be things that you would do. You couldn't just be an elected member and never attend anything or make any contribution. You'd have to fulfill a certain set of criteria. But in order to demonstrate value for people in terms of their learning or their future career, because I think it might be an important and useful consideration. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Do you want to reply to that, Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And thank you, Councillor Taylor. I think that's a very good point. Obviously, separate to this, the committee receives the reports of the independent remuneration panel. And yeah, I think you make an important point in terms of that break. It came through strongly in the conversations that we had around the issue of remuneration, firstly, and the limitation that places on people as they try and trade off between career and giving time through politics, which, as you rightly recognise, is not a job in a traditional sense, and there is a public service degree, but nonetheless you need to be secured enough income in order to live and run a household in order to do that, because the level of remuneration is not sufficient that you could be a councillor alone with any ease. And I think on the other point, in terms of just briefly of development, again, a very good point. And this is something we've spoken around how members' development can be better recognised. And I guess all of us in our careers at different stages are sort of quite used to going to different events and sessions where people talk about continuous professional development and demonstrating the applicability of what you pick up at different events and learning exercise to your career. And I think that's something that we've tried to capture in this response, the need for perhaps something at a Welsh Government level to really formalise that and ensure that the experience of councillors is recognised and that those transferable skills can be better understood by employers in future through some more formal sort of structures around learning.
It's still that could be strengthened.
Yeah, absolutely.
Joe?
Thank you. Firstly, I'd like to echo a number of the things that Francis has already mentioned in terms of trying to attract people of more working family age. We do need to certainly look at remuneration and also getting our employers to have a better understanding of what the requirements of being a counsellor are. I've recently had 2 conversations with women of my sort of age, with families, with jobs, and one of them said, well, there's no way I could ever stand to be a counsellor. My employer would never let me have the time off. And the other one was really concerned as to whether she would ever manage to balance out work and family life in with that. And if you can't ever even manage to say, well, look, it's a really good salary, maybe you could take a step back or reduce hours or things like that, then it's unlikely that these people will be able to stand for election, let alone then continue at that sort of time. So we're not going to get those sorts of people in unless we can manage to show something more clearly. But part of that is also speaking to employers and making sure that employers understand what the real role of a counsellor is and how that actually might bring value back into their organisation as well. And so the fact that actually it can be a person who will then grow through being a counsellor, which will then improve their working life in the separate organisation. And so that would be a really useful thing I think we need to look at. And then one of the other things you put in the report was about social media. I think that's a really important area to consider because social media actually is one of the ways a younger modern councillor maybe engages in a certain amount of ward work. Personally, I do a lot of my work via social media. I am active, foolish me, on Caldecott Community Facebook page and deal with an awful lot of residents' complaints and queries through that media. And it might actually be very useful to gain a better understanding for how councillors can actually proactively work in that democratic setting through social media in a more planned way, perhaps. I mean, I deliberately don't get into any of the slanging matches that go on social media, and I'm very considered as to what my actual responses are, and I'm always doing it very much with my council hat on as well. But it is really important that this new way of interacting with residents, which is very immediate, and you do have residents expecting you to respond at 10 o'clock at night, and sometimes you just have to turn it off and not pay any attention. But you have to be able to it would be very useful, I think, maybe to have some sort of development in that area as well for how we can better represent what being a councillor is via social media. And it might be an area that we might want to look at in terms of training for councillors as to how they can safely use social media and how they can be effective through it as well.
Thank you. Do you want to respond to that, man?
No, again, I understand that absolutely. I think similar to the point Councillor Taylor made, there's an element of it being in there, but perhaps it needs to be strengthened, and you make the point, I think, quite well, whereas perhaps what's written in here at the moment is some of the more negative aspects of social media. There is a positive aspect, and it can also be helpful. So to strengthen a little more on the more sort of positive potential of social media, if sort of development and training exists to enable people to capitalise on that, it can actually help a diversity of people engage with the role of councillor, doing that work in new ways. So yeah, I look to strengthen the report in that area.
Thank you. Are you happy then for Mac to submit the report, but with the amendments? Yes? Yes. Right. Can I have a show of hands, please?
Just a very simple practical point. Mine is one of the badges that refuses to lift the barrier, and I'll happily hand it in when I leave the building today. Just wondered how long the replacement is likely to take.
Yeah, they can normally do it there and then, but yeah, if there is a small queue, or depending on the time you leave, if you just use, if anyone is struggling and their badge isn't working, just use a token in the short term. And when you've got a spare 5 minutes, if you go down to the office behind reception, they've got the printing machine there, and they will run off another badge.
Francis?
So when I was reading through this, is the purpose of giving us this for us to draw out items that we think in particular would be relevant to the public? Is this part of the piece around forward planning where we think there's a desire, a need to engage more people in decision making? Yes, that's right. So from that point of view then, like when I was having a little look through, I was thinking, well, in particular, public interest pieces, I mean, this was just my view, so other people may have different views, would seem obviously, and again, I'm just talking from my own, so the additional learning needs changes, that may, be of particular interest to a large number of people. The budget, obviously. And then, in particular, the childcare offer, which comes in from January, I believe, and offers up to 30 hours free childcare to all eligible families. And there's a big piece of work that are trying to get people aware and engaged in that. So, I mean, they were just things that jumped off the page to me. I'm sure there are lots of others, and I'm obviously probably coming at it from the point of view of families in particular, whereas others will have a different point of view. But those were three things that I think it may be worth having a discussion about, how Democratic Services Committee can kind of, I guess, secure more voices in that decision making, or how we can ensure that, communities and members of the public have an opportunity to feed in their views to those things. Undoubtedly, there's hundreds, everything from, Crick Road developments, I'm sure that would be of interest if I was, that might be obviously to you. And I think and my point is, I think there's quite a few, so I think we probably have to pick the ones in particular that Democratic Services may want to put some additional, shape round, asking some of the selects, what they're going to do around engaging people and working with them on it. Is that what we were? I was kind of not 100% clear about, is that what you want us to do today with that? Because it was just like a big list.
I guess, yeah, thank you very much for the question, because that's a very good point, and I guess it hasn't explicitly changed in terms of how we present the agenda. So I guess for the benefit of anyone watching on the live stream, at the committee's last meeting, it received a report back and some recommendations from a small member subgroup of this committee, when we explored the need for, firstly, forward planners to be looking far more into the future, and as Councillor Taylor has rightly said, identifying those issues where there is a greater, well, perhaps it could be a number of areas. One where we benefit substantially from further input from the public because they're broad-ranging issues, but also where issues may be potentially contentious, and actually rather than items come forward seemingly quite late in the day and issues get raised in a public open forum, there is actually a much more proactive, earlier engagement with people to seek views. It hasn't, I guess, where we're at with that, we haven't fully concluded that work, and I was hoping to organise another meeting of that subgroup just to understand a way forward with that, but also in terms of that Councillor Dovey's point as to how to bring in Abby Barton and Rhiann Cook from the comms and engagement team to sort of perhaps understand how we can take some of those exercises forward using their experience of involvement and engagement, and perhaps help us sort of build almost a toolkit of different ways in which we could go out and engage. But I think actually it's quite a timely question, and probably worth, as you say, Councillor Taylor, having a little look at those now, flagging these up earlier on, and perhaps even though we may not have the answers today for exactly how you wish to take these forward, that we can ask officers to take a look at that, where we have these upcoming decisions, and put together some proposals for you around how we could potentially look to engage differently around some of these issues.
David?
Thank you, Chair. I'm conscious of the pressures that the officers are under, which inevitably puts us under pressures as well. And the things that I find a little worrying is some of the things that have happened recently, and I think I understand the reasons why they happen, but nevertheless, I mean, we've had a couple of instances where, in actual fact, we said on committees, no, you can't bring it to us this close. You know, we haven't had time to check it out, give it consideration, talk amongst ourselves, however the committee sort of works. And that really worries me. And the other thing that concerns me is that there are areas that are common to other committees here that used to be picked up. We used to have, you and I were old soldiers, David, we used to have a cross-cut, the expression cross-cutting issues, and those were recognised by the officers, and when there was a cross-cutting issue, then it was signalled up to the 1, 2, maybe in extremes, even more than that, where there were parts of the activities that could come together and with a concerted effort probably get a better result rather than the expertise, if you get my meaning, not mixing together. It's going on in two different places. The other thing is, very often the committee, one committee doesn't know that the other committee is having a committee meeting that is important to what they are talking about. And so we're not getting that right either. And Matt knows I've said this before, but we've got to find a way of the officers being aware of what is happening within the various committees. I'm sure they are, but it is just that trigger that goes off and says, well, that's been happening, that refers to I don't know, air quality and what's going on with the Transport Committee. What are they doing about that? I'm clutching at straws a bit here to find the right ones to refer to. But I think we are missing in places that ability to pull the whole picture together. And if the officers could get up in their sort of balloon and look down at what is going on, you can see the places where these things have a synergy together, and they should that brain power should be put together and used together. That was a sort of rambling way of saying I think we're missing a trick in harnessing the knowledge and the opportunities that are going on within the various committees.
Do you want to answer that Mike, first?
Yeah, thank you. One thing that I guess it's important to remember is, I guess before some of you were actually on council, we used to have a group called the Coordinating Board, and the Coordinating Board's role was to look at those issues that may sort of fall between two committees or which there could be an overlap and take a decision on. Now, the Coordinating Board no longer exists. I think it probably now it does fall to this committee actually to oversee that process. So on several agendas there has been an item of coordinating items, and if you recall last time out we had one on the issue of automation where Councillor Pavia came forward from Economy and Development and said actually I think Democratic Services could be looking at this, and we had some discussion around that. So I think you raise a very fair point, and perhaps around this agenda item, you're used to seeing for information these council and cabinet forward work plans towards the end of the agenda and taking a quick look at them. Actually there may be some instances where we need to position and give you a clearer steer where officers have identified some potential either synergies or gaps in that coordinating role, just to take a step back and say actually where should this be going on its way through to the decision making process. The other one that's just worth sort of flagging up from HO under that item ties back to another point you've made around an awareness of what's going on. The subgroup began to look at this issue of perhaps a member briefing, because not everyone has the opportunity to read every paper that comes before them. As officers we certainly don't, and as members it must be doubly difficult because we're here 37 hours a week doing this day in, day out. You have to catch up with all of these papers in the time you have available for your council work. So we're looking at putting together a group to put together that monthly briefing so that people understand the decisions that have been taken recently, what the outcomes were, what's upcoming, to make it slightly easier for members to navigate the wealth of paperwork and goings on within the organisation a little more easily. So hopefully that will be of some assistance in that. And just to stress in terms of those issues that fall between stools, this is something that the committee can discuss and make recommendations on where they should go.
Thank you.
Could I just add one more point?
Yes.
Some of us are town councillors as well. And if you take what comes out of the town council and add it on to what you do as a county councillor, you really do have a workload. And the thing is now within Chepstow Town Council, they have decided to run a different platform. So now they're sending emails out on a different platform to the one we're running. It's going in the way of an absolute recipe for disaster. I'll give you a classic example. We had the mayor in Chepstow. It was his bash this weekend. And so I got ready to go, and Steph was sat there, and I thought, well, she's taking it easy today, you know, she's going to make a mad dash for it. And I said, come on, it's time to get ready. We've got to be down in Chippy Chepstow. And she said, I've not been invited. You know, which is absolutely stupid. You have a situation where a past mayor of Chepstow, who should have been invited to be there, and she's not on any platform that they're using to inform them. So I'm just really trying to say this is a bit of shifting sound in a way in terms of what is happening. If you've got a platform working like that is that incomplete, it could possibly impact on what we're doing here. And I think the county should be aware of. Well, I don't know what's happening in Caldecott or anywhere else, but in Chepstow they've gone off and they've done this thing. So it's I don't know whether anybody else is doing the same sort of thing.
In Caldecott, they've done the same. They've got their own website and emails. The council's got all their own email addresses. Martin.
Thank you, Chair. I think Mr. Gatehouse has addressed at least one of the points I was going to make, so there's no need for me to do that, but that was the role of this committee. And I think certainly it's been made clear since I joined that one of the things that we did would be to pull together when reports or areas of interest of any kind affect several pockets, that there's a coordinating element to the work that we do here, and perhaps that could be developed further. But I also think that an excellent role is being played by the scrutiny manager. And certainly in my role as chair of CYP, I have met quite regularly together with the scrutiny manager and the chair of adult committee, because often there will be issues around, for example, the family, where children and parents might both have an interest in some item. And the scrutiny manager has got us together with relevant senior officers to actually look at the year ahead and the senior officers planning when they'll be bringing reports. And as a consequence, we've actually had several joint committees of CYP and adult. And I think that's an excellent way, and certainly it saves officers having to come along twice to say exactly the same thing, as well as enabling us as the elected members to put forward a much more coordinated response to reports that are brought to us. So I'd like to see a greater development of the scrutiny manager working with chairs of committees to say there's common grounds here. How are you going to make sure that they're covered by both standing committees, and is there a case indeed for a joint committee from time to time? And I think when CYP and adult have worked together, it's been some quite positive outcomes as a result.
Good. Excellent. Do you want to respond to that, man?
No, I think I recognise those and very important points. It's probably remiss of me not to mention the role of the scrutiny manager actually in this sort of coordination space, but no, absolutely recognise that and agree wholeheartedly.
Francis?
Clarify the outcome, Chair. So that small group, you were talking about the subgroup, is going to look at this and is going to look at which of those in particular, and then that'll come back to us as, but some of them are, the reports are going, or so how will you communicate with us in the meantime then, will you, Matt?
Yes, what I say, it might, with the Chair's permission, just be worth just reflecting back on the three you've mentioned. So there are two aspects. One, the subgroup will meet again and agree a sort of process of how these things are handled more systematically in future and bring that back to the committee. So the committee last time received a report from the subgroup which set out sort of direction of travel and a principle to how we would work. but hasn't necessarily put all the meat on the bones in terms of exactly how that will happen. In the short term, you've rightly identified a number of important issues which could have implications and which fit with those discussions we've had as requiring a greater degree of involvement. And without having that process in place, if there are, on top of those 3 issues that have been mentioned, any more that members wish to raise today, specifically in the short term until we bottom out that process, I'll pick them up with Abby and Rhiannon in comms and put in place some proposals which we can come back to you with around how we could engage on those particular issues. So that would be a short-term solution until we have something more sustainable in place. So the ones I've made a note on that were raised earlier, Councillor Taylor, were the budget, the ALN changes and the childcare offer as 3 that particularly stand out as perhaps requiring a greater degree of involvement and consultation on their way to decision making. So explore those with the report authors and the comms and engagement team. But are there others that people feel warrant a look through that lens of greater involvement and engagement prior to decision making?
Thank you, Mike. Can I ask you then, Matt, when are you proposing to have the next meeting with the subcommittee? I think it'd be better if it was sooner than later.
Yes, well, it's my intention actually to sort of get a note out last week and ask for some dates. Just time has got away from me. I'm conscious that holidays are coming up, but I'll undertake to get a sort of note around the subgroup before the end of the afternoon, just seeking people's availability in the coming weeks, but recognising that we are getting into holiday season and the likelihood of being able to get the full group together is fairly limited. So it might be, if the committee are happy with this, that we proceed with that work with, if we can get sort of 3/4 of that group there, so as not to lose momentum on this work.
Thank you.
Coming into holiday time, but there is a county council on, I think it's the 26th of July.
Yes.
In case it's worth, asking if those members will be around and could meet for half an hour prior to council. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, but Chair, if I may be so bold, with at least sort of 4 members of the subgroup in the chamber, would you mind if I ask that question now? How people would feel meeting around council on the 26th?
Yes.
Chair, if I may then, so I was hoping it may have been a simple yes, no. If it's not, I'll go back to the previous email and just try and resolve that, because I guess we'll...
Test a time on that morning and see who can make it.
Okay, yep.
All right. Right. On the agenda now is it's not on the agenda. The cabinet member Sarah Jones would like to come in and speak on the help me out here now.
I'm hoping it's on Democracy Week. Was that what you were hoping I would talk about? Yeah, so I met up with the chair and we spoke about the Democracy Week that was held last October, and for members that were there at that, with which I think quite a few people in this room were, it was a really good event with young people held with our schools on the one day in the chamber. So I was just asking the chair and Democratic Services, what are our plans for this Democracy Week, October this year? And hoping we could replicate that event again, but also do something a bit more wide-ranging, particularly maybe with our primary schools. So whilst the Democracy Week is focused at democracy across all ages, again, I think the focus should be on young people. It would be good to have a young people focus, not, withstanding the fact that we do need to focus on all ages. So it'd be good to do that Young People's Democracy Day again specifically, but also maybe to do a debating competition for our primary schools, of which the winning schools or the top 3 or 4 schools could come forward to council the following week and maybe present to us as a group. Any other ideas welcome, really. I'm just hoping we could really make the most of that week as a window of opportunity to really engage our young people as part of Democracy Week. And I'm meeting with Engage to Change, which is our youth council, on the 5th of August. So I wanted to pose those ideas to them and get their input as well. But it's just really a start of a 10. Are people keen to support? And have you got any other ideas that we might be able to follow up on? Thank you, Chair. That's it.
Anybody?
First of all, can I just check what week is Democracy Week? What's the date?
I think it's the week that has the 7th of October in.
15th to the 21st of October.
Thank you.
I'm turning this on, sorry. With regard to the whole issue of diversity and democracy, Si, and we all were talking about the fact that in addition to, frankly, you know, Democracy Week, there is a need, if we're really serious, for a little more of a systematic approach. So I would have thought that we would be keen to support that, but also perhaps, you know, keen to get some feedback back of you know, what else we can do outside of Democracy Week, to have those regular contacts with our schools, and not just the youth councils, you know, but a little bit wider, because it's, you know.
Yeah,
so
absolutely.
yes.
Maybe that's another piece of work that we could report back on, because there is really good activity that happens, and sometimes we're not always aware about it. Some of the work that goes on in terms of outreach with schools, and I've just met with the community and partnership team, and we were talking about specifically how do we reach out to those groups of children who are not necessarily in your Scouts, your Brownies, your community groups. You know, how do we get them involved in things early on to ensure they don't necessarily suffer issues like loneliness and isolation within their community? So it's linking it all together. But I take your point. This isn't just 1 week. It shouldn't just be 1 week of activity. It's just an opportunity during that week. But absolutely, we should be doing more to encourage that diversity piece, and ensuring we've got active citizens. And I know active citizenship is one of the steps under the PSB, one of the partnership groups, and they're doing a specific plan around active citizenship. So I'd be keen that we have a heavy influence in that. But maybe come back to you and give that some thought, if that's all right, about maybe a more cohesive, coherent plan on how we do some outreach with young people. So, yeah. Okay.
Thank you, Chair. Just looking in the diary on the Thursday in Democracy Week, the 18th, there is actually a CYP meeting. It might be nice if we could have something on the agenda about democracy and young people at that meeting.
And what were you looking at now?
Thursday, the 18th of October, CYP.
Sorry, perhaps you could have your CYP chaired by young people on that day, Chair. Chaired and...
Yes, Joe.
I was just wondering, how many of our secondary schools actually have some sort of democratic council body which works in this sort of way that maybe we can tap into in some respect? What's actually going on already in the schools, and how can we draw links in terms of our engagement? Do we have any ideas?
I think that if I can come back in on that point, Chair, and I think maybe that comes into this sort of, if I can do a bit of mapping for you and come back to you as a committee, maybe to this committee, and talk, I'll feed in with Richard John, obviously, in terms of his cabinet role, and we can map all this out and find out what actually is happening out in our schools and our communities to engage young people, and what maybe the opportunity is for us to do a bit more, because I think, you know, there's the wills there, it certainly is amongst us as a group, but yeah, if I could come back to the committee, Chair, if you wouldn't mind, if I did a mapping exercise and reported back to you.
Yes,
okay?
I appreciate that. The other thing, we at the pre-meeting, we mentioned about having prizes for them. Am I correct?
Chair.
And where would they come from? How would they be funded, the prizes?
I'm not sure. I mean, that's something for us to look at. But we wanted, the status of being Monmouthshire's top debating school, or is having the accolade. But yeah, we can certainly look maybe to get a bit of sponsorship, or look to see if we can fund that. To give that school something back. Obviously from their willingness to take part in the competition. But hopefully it'll be a good, as I say, accolade for the school to be able to say they've won the.
I think it would encourage if we could get some sort of prize for the schools.
It was just for reference, it just made me remember that my son's school has just recently visited Westminster, and when they came back into school, they've spent a certain amount of time now looking at politics and the wonderful world of politics, and they did actually end up in a class discussion about the implementation of a high-speed railway, and each one of them had to take on different roles. And so I think it'd be lovely to have that maybe brought out, so that schools which have already begun to do these sorts of things, this is a primary school level, this was year 6 students, and that's already there, and it'd be great if they could then experience what that would be like to go into school as well, maybe amongst clusters. That might be really good, yeah.
Martin?
Thank you, Chair. There is already the Rotary Youth Speak Award, which certainly my secondary school, where I'm a governor at King Henry, very actively participates in that, and I believe all the Monmouthshire secondary schools do. Maybe it's something we could look to do in conjunction with Rotary, because there's your prizes if you're looking for prizes. but they do it in each individual school. Why not in the grandeur of this council chamber?
We'll set the ball rolling because we'll need to talk to the schools ASAP really, but we'll come back to you and engage with you throughout that process if that's okay. But if we've got your in principle support that we go ahead again this year, that's great. Pardon? Thank you, Chair. Thank you.
Sorry, can I just ask one further question? Are you including primary schools with this?
I think there was going to be 2 strands. I thought the debating competition would be primary schools, but the Young People's Day, so we actually bring the secondary schools in like we did last time and did some work with them. But there might be, we'll map something out on that side to see if there's anything further we can do actually in secondary schools. So we'll have the day here and maybe do some outreach with the 4 secondary schools as well during the week.
Can I thank you all very much for attending? It's a quick meeting, so you better get back out in the sun.